We are discussing the buyer-broker agreement. Remember, this is for GCAAR. This covers Montgomery County, Maryland, and DC. Excuse me. This agreement made on, say, today's date. When we click between, we'll get a pop-up here for name of first buyer. We're going to use our friend Joe Smith again. If there's a second buyer, we put their name in. And the buyer broker. So let's say it's Keller Williams Realty Alliance. We can just put Keller Williams Realty Reston and assigns me, Jonathan Coles, as a licensee of the broker. Again, we are going to be the agent. And buyer broker is hereby granted the right to represent buyer in the purchase, option, or exchange of real property or co-op units. Remember, a co-op, you're buying shares of stock in a housing corporation. And periodically through the course of when you're filling these forms out in Lone Wolf, you'll see a circle that comes up in the center. That means it's auto-saving for you. So you don't need to worry about hitting the save button on the upper right-hand corner. It auto-saves. So every contract, every agreement has to have a purchase. And here we're establishing a brokerage relationship, an agency relationship between the buyer and the broker. Remember, the client is always owned by the broker or the brokerage. And we're also creating a contractual obligation between the buyer and the broker in which the broker and licensee, directly supervised by the broker, have an exclusive right to represent the buyer under the terms and conditions in this contract. So, the buyer broker has some responsibilities that we need to comply with. The buyer broker and agent agree to, one, use professional knowledge and skills to locate and present property, which is available for purchase and suitable for the buyer. Number two, we're also going to assist the buyer through the process of the acquisition. We're going to assist them in showing properties. We're going to assist them in maybe being present for the home inspection. We're going to help them with the mortgage. And we're also going to get them through settlement. Number three, and we're also going to represent the interest of a buyer in all negotiations and transactions, including the acquisition of property. That's what they're hiring us for. Notwithstanding the fact that buyer, broker, and or agent may receive compensation from other parties. We'll talk about that a little bit later in 2 paragraphs. So, when we're having our buyer consultation, we need to explain to the buyer, these are all of the things that we are going to be doing for you. Paragraph 3, we're going into buyer responsibilities. Buyer will work exclusively with buyer, broker, and agent during the term of this agreement, and will only contact agent with questions or showing requests about properties. This is where we need to have a serious conversation with our buyer clients, because we know once their real estate antenna go up, they're going to stop at every open house they see. They're going to go into new builds. They're going to go into new construction. And we need to let them know that when they do go to open houses, buyer agrees to notify party representing the seller of this agreement. Basically, that they're being represented by an agent. And for new home builders and new home houses, buyer agrees to make any first visit to a new home builder's model only while accompanied by the agent. Buyer will furnish buyer broker with necessary financial and personal information to reasonably establish buyer's ability to purchase property and authorizes the release of such information to seller and seller's broker. So this is generally your proof of funds. This is generally your pre-approval letter with the lender. And remember, we need to have this conversation with the buyer that, yes, we are representing you, but if you're going to open houses and new builds, etc., they ask, do you have an agent? Yes, you do. It's John Coles. One of the other things I recommend is you can go on Amazon or Staples or anywhere, and they have things called coin envelopes. And coin envelopes fit 5 or 6 business cards very nicely. So what I do is I'll take 5 or 6 business cards, put them in these envelopes, and I would give a number to Joe Smith, whom this buyer broker agreement is with, and we can and then he can have them when he goes to open houses with all my information. Number 4, we're getting into compensation. As we've talked about before and in numerous conversations, compensation is negotiable and not prescribed by law or established by any membership organization such as GCAAR, MAR, DCAAR, Bright MLS, NAR, etc. Paragraph A, buyer agrees to pay buyer broker a percentage of the sale price or a dollar amount for any property contracted to be purchased during the term of this agreement, no matter who locates the property. So let's say I'm charging my buyer 3%. We go out, we look at properties, seller isn't paying a compensation, buyer is responsible for it. Or cute little buyers walking down the street, they see a FSBO, a for sale by owner. They contact us, say we want to see it, and the for sale by owner is not paying a buyer agent. The buyer is responsible for paying it. And as we continue, buyer is responsible for payment at settlement. Continuation, if buyer broker receives any compensation from seller or seller's representatives for services covered in the agreement, that amount will be credited toward the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer broker compensation. So, if the listing agent or seller agrees to pay 2%, the buyer pays 1%. Or if the seller provides 2.5%, the buyer agrees to pay the other half. Paragraph B, if you are charging a broker service fee, that would go in this line here, and it gets paid at settlement, regardless of any seller payment of compensation. Letter C, if you are charging a retainer fee. This is an advance fee to retain the services of a buyer broker, and it will be credited against the compensation due at settlement. Notice, credited against broker compensation. It's prepaid commission. They're paying you a fee up front in order to work with you. If you've ever worked with an attorney, they charge a retainer fee, again, paid up front in order for their services. Letter D is the protection period. Just like in listing agreements, we have a protection period. And let's just put 90 days in here for discussion. Buyer broker compensation shall be paid to buyer broker if there is a settlement of any property contracted to be purchased within 90 days of the termination of this agreement, unless buyer enters into a new agreement during the protection period. So we terminate the agreement, and then um, buyer works with a new agent and buys something we showed them. We are SOL. Shh, out of luck. Paragraph E, amount of compensation offered. This was a huge change from 2024 when there were big changes. Total compensation received from any source may not exceed the amount or rate agreed to in this agreement. Buyer broker compensation paid by seller, if any, must be specified in an addendum to the sales contract. So again, there will be an additional form saying how much the seller might be paying a broker or not. Compensation is due at settlement unless buyer, after sales contract acceptance, fails to perform or is in otherwise default to the contract and executes a release in which buyer broker is not a party to the sales contract after all contingencies have been removed. In such case, buyer broker compensation is due no later than the previously agreed settlement date. If buyer enters into a contract with seller during the original term of the agreement and seller defaults, then the original term of the agreement is extended by the number of days it was under contract. Again, this is similar to the GCAAR listing agreement that, let's say we're under contract for 10 days, our buyer agency contract extends by 10 days. And letter G, attorney's fees. If buyer broker prevails in any action brought to obtain payment of buyer broker compensation, buyer broker shall also be entitled to recover such action buyer broker's reasonable attorney's fees and court costs. And we're continuing on the next line. Or we're not. Attorney's fees and court costs. I believe they missed the period here. So again, we can get reasonable attorney's fees. Not all, but reasonable. Number 5 goes over the term of the agreement. The agreement starts when signed and expires on 11/59 on whatever date you and the buyer agree on. Let's just say it's going to be December 31st. Unless extended in writing or unless earlier terminated. If a contract of sale is entered into buyer before expiration date, which provides for a settlement date after the expiration date, the agreement will automatically be extended until settlement has occurred or until the sales contract is released in writing. For Maryland, the agreement may be no longer than a year. DC, it could be however long you agree. Maryland, 1 year. So for termination in DC, terminated prior to expiration date only by mutual written consent of both parties. And remember, in Maryland, it's a little bit different. And again, you can put whatever number of days you and your buyer agree to in writing. I just put 1 for this example. The brokerage relationship established in this agreement may be unilaterally terminated prior to the expiration date by either party delivering again, this example, 1 day's advance notice to the other party. Even if the brokerage relationship is terminated under the terms above, the contractual obligation shall remain in full force and effect unless terminated by written mutual consent of all parties. In addition, the terms of paragraph 4D shall survive, even if this agreement is terminated only. So, what does that mean? That means that, let's go back up to 4D, the protection period. The protection period survives even if we terminate this agreement in Maryland. Paragraph 7 goes over disclaimers and limitations. Buyer acknowledges that buyer broker is retained solely as a licensee and has been advised to seek legal professional advice for legal, tax, appraisal, home inspection, surveying, engineering, and other matters. Buyer acknowledges that buyer broker may represent other buyers and other potential buyers and may consider, make offers, or purchase properties through the buyer broker. So you can show this same property to multiple buyers. Buyer consents to buyer's broker representation of other buyers before, during, and after expiration of this agreement. Again, that we can represent other buyers at any time. Upon receipt by buyer broker of a ratified contract to purchase pursuant to this agreement, buyer broker shall have no further obligation hereunder to procure any subsequent properties for buyer. So once we get a property under contract, we're not searching for anything else. Buyer agrees that buyer broker may perform ministerial acts for seller. A ministerial act is a routine act that does not involve discretion or exercise of buyer's own judgment. Buyer acknowledges that the possibility that seller or seller's representative may not treat the existence, terms, or conditions of buyer's offer as confidential information. So we need to have a conversation with our buyer that once we make an offer, a listing agent can what we call shop or sell their name, the number, the purchase price to other people. Paragraph 8 goes into laws and regulations. So, buyer acknowledges that buyer broker must comply with federal, state, local laws and regulations, and that as a realtor, buyer broker must also adhere to the Code of Ethics from the National Association of Realtors. Now, delivery, this is delivery of documents. Hand carried, sent by overnight delivery service, sent by wire or electronic medium, which produces a tangible record of the transmission, such as fax or email, which includes an attachment with an actual copy of the executed instruments being transmitted, or by U.S. postal mailing. 99% of the time, it's going to be emailed. In the event of overnight delivery service, delivery has been deemed the next business day following the sending, unless earlier receipt is acknowledged in writing. In the event of U.S. postal mailing, delivery shall be deemed to have been made on the third business day following the mailing, unless earlier receipt is acknowledged. Notice this agreement shall be deemed enforceable when it and all addenda and modifications have been signed, initialed where required by buyer and buyer broker, and delivered to the other party. Again, with electronic signatures, it is extremely easy to set up your documents that the buyer signs it, the broker signs it, and everybody gets a fully signed copy. Paragraph headings are for reference and convenience only and do not define, limit the intent, rights, or obligations of the parties. And as we've seen in other contracts, the singular includes the plural includes the singular. So if it means buyer, it means buyers, or seller and sellers. Paragraph 9, inclusions, agreement, and receipt. This document and the attachments as noted below contain the full and entire agreement between buyer and buyer broker and supersede any prior or contemporaneous agreements, meaning any extra agreements, if any, written or oral between the parties. Each party acknowledges a receipt of the copy of this agreement. I just discussed that. In accordance with Maryland or DC. And if you're practicing in Maryland, we're including this form here, the consent for dual agency. And if you're on a team, you might be including this bottom one. Or if you're in DC, the consent for dual and designated representation. So again, it's important to know which is included. The rest of paragraph 9 talks about dual agency. In the event of dual agency, when either the buyer or buyer broker decline to consent in writing, either party may terminate this agreement by written notice to the other party. What I always recommend is getting the consent for dual agency in Maryland and or the consent for dual or designated representation signed when we get the buyer broker agreement signed. That way we can have the discussion of dual agency with the client up front right away. And again, properly explain dual agency. Remember, in Maryland, they don't quasi practice dual agency. The broker becomes a dual agent because the buyer agent and the listing agent are within the same brokerage. DC, an agent can be the listing agent and the listing agent and the buyer agent, so they can represent both sides in DC. Do I think it's a good idea? No, but that's a story for another day. Paragraph 10 is where you would add additional provisions. You generally don't have any that you would add. And then it is signed by the buyer. Here we just have one, that's Joe Smith. The buyer broker or supervisor. So again, the broker would sign it here. The buyer broker licensee. And again, my name auto-populates because I'm the buyer broker licensee. I'm the buyer agent. And then we would want to finish filling out the brokerage address down here on these lines and the phone number. And then over on the left, the buyer's address, email, and phone number. And that should finish up your buyer broker agreement.